Thank you very much. We're here today, Paula Maccabee and Waverly Rybel and Don Arnosti. All of us are with WaterLegacy. And we're going to talk today about Earth Day Broken Promises. And I want to thank everybody for being here and thank you for caring about our water and our lands and our people. Next slide, please. And I'm going to say that we're going to go pretty quickly because there's a lot to cover. And that doesn't mean we don't want your participation. We want your participation very much. And we'd like you to please put questions in chat so that Waverly can make sure we get to them. Or at the end of our discussion, we'll have an opportunity to answer questions either by chat or by raising hands and talking aloud. And Don and I have done this before, and we are willing to stay here as long as there are still people who want to answer questions or ask questions or make statements. And this is a picture of Lake Superior, and WaterLegacy's work is protecting Minnesota's waters and the communities that rely on them. Don Arnosti has been involved in protecting the environment and environmental justice for 35 years as an organizer, a policy director, an executive director, a whole lot of really, really important titles. My background, I've been a public interest lawyer and litigator and campaign strategist for 40 years. And I've done work for the government and for nonprofits. And the last 11 years, I've worked with WaterLegacy. Next slide. And what are we going to do? Here's our outline. Don is going to take a big picture and sort of explain what is regulatory capture, what is the source of the problem, and give you a sense that this is not just about mining, because a lot of WaterLegacy's work focuses on mining and mine pollution, and there's a lot more to regulatory capture than that. I'm going to talk about the broken promises in terms of justice, WaterLegacy's work, and then what we can do to restore protection of people and water. And now take it away, Don. Next slide.
Next slide, please. Okay, the term regulatory capture may not be familiar to many of you, even many of you very deeply involved in environmental protection. So we're going to dig into this just a little bit. What do we mean by this? Regulatory capture, as defined there on the right, basically means when an agency is acting on behalf of private interests, often those they're supposed to be regulating, rather than the public benefit for which they were created. They have been captured by those they're supposed to be regulating. The public interest, of course, is anything that affects the rights, health, or finances of the public at large. We understand that the interpretation of exactly where the public interest begins and where private interests end, there may be a gray zone, and that is the job of government to act in that place and to make those determinations. But if you could switch the slide, Waverly. Our thesis is the regulatory capture has become the current state of Minnesota governance, that at a minimum, this is affecting the agencies of the Pollution Control Agency, the DNR, the Departments of Agriculture and Health. And we're confining our discussion to that because this is the area where Paula and I have worked so much. But if those of you may be familiar with other parts of government, other arms of government, both local, national, I would contend that this thesis applies there as well. It is unfortunately an artifact of our current democracy, but we are going to confine our discussion and our examples to the turf where we're quite familiar. We want to make a distinction between direct corruption, where there's a quid pro quo. This is where you see the occasional circumstance where a government official might be convicted in court, where it can be very, very clearly tied that they made a very specific action in return for a bag of money from somebody. That is not what we're talking about. We're not contending that that is the norm here in Minnesota, even though there are instances of government corruption. It is a more subtle thing where regulatory capture is more about the state of mind, where you can think of it as PTSD. the officials are so battered and bruised by the political process or the pressure that are applied to them, usually directly through the political process, sometimes with, the corporate lobbyists or people of that they are in essence cringing. They're avoiding their duty and instead twisting the outcomes of the agency to bend to the pressure that is being applied. So regulatory capture harms without maybe a proven quid pro quo, but you sure know it when you see it. And we're going to go into some of that. If you could go to the next slide. Why are we in this situation? We're going to get to some examples a little bit later, but first we're going to talk about why we're in this problem. As I said, we're focusing on the state of Minnesota and these state government agencies, just to narrow this thesis down to something we can get our arms around in 1 hour. For example, the mission of the Department of Health is there on the left. It's to protect, maintain, and improve the health of all Minnesotans. That's terrific. That's exactly what we want them to do. Unfortunately, when the Department of Health runs up against the powerful interests that are often creating environmental health risks, such as corporate agriculture or the mining industry, we find that the Department of Health does little more than issue warnings and then disappear. So they put out, for instance, fish advisories about high levels of mercury, which are even higher in the areas near the mines. We know that much mercury is deposited through the air and is ubiquitous, global. But we have concentrated sources in certain regions of the state, and we hear nothing more from them, but here's your fish advisory. The Department of Agriculture, as I said, this is not confined to any one particular department. So Department of Agriculture is charged by the legislature with promoting agriculture and regulating the fertilizers and pesticides that corporate agriculture depends on. So they are both promoting the practice of it and then regulating it. It's a tough charge. Department of Natural Resources both promotes and regulates mining and forestry. And I can tell you they do one half of that job much better than they do the other half. Wildlife, and natural resources and recreation, of course, are promoted here in Minnesota. That's part of the reason we all live here. We love these things, enjoy them. But unfortunately, there are no strong voices that can stack up, and wildlife, natural resources take the hit from a lot of pollution. If you could go to the next slide. So this is not an issue that is confined to a single political party. This has been a variety of commissioners and the assistant commissioners through multiple years. As I said, I have been closely involved for 35 years, going back to Rudy Perpich. And so both Republican, Democratic, and the independent 4 years we had with Jesse Ventura, these problems were there. I would say that the problems are getting worse through time, and there's a variety of reasons for that, including Citizen United. We could talk about that. But fundamentally, this is not about pointing a finger at the Republicans or the Democrats. It's really a problem of our democracy. In recent years, this slide lists a number of things that have happened. So for example, the MPCA Citizens Board was eliminated in 2015 after they had the temerity to order an EIS for a 9,000 cow dairy when the staff and the commissioner didn't want to do that. Governor Dayton signed that into law, the elimination of the MPCA board. They have been required, there have been several different pieces of legislation passed in the last few years requiring the agency to speed through permitting, putting deadlines on the completion of their task, but not really worrying about the quality of their task. Paula's going to tell you about some of the miserable permits they've been issuing under pressure just to get them out the door. Agencies in rulemakings have been ordered to analyze the cost of the regulations to the polluters, but they're not really paying as much attention to the real cost to natural resources and people. the state has passed laws that have been signed into law by Governor Dayton in this case, that have illegally ordered the state not to apply basically the federal law, Federal Clean Water Act standards. Again, Paula will get into some of that. We have appropriators that are regularly, and in fact, right now the legislature is meeting, and I guarantee you, behind closed doors, there is a lot of pressure being applied to agencies with regard to, we will be withholding this piece of your budget, or we will be redirecting that if you don't do what we want. That's what goes on. I've been in political negotiations dozens of times. That is what goes on. And finally, at the bottom there, we're talking about the millions and millions of dollars, your dollars and my dollars, that have been paid to a private mining company law firm to represent you and me on behalf of the MPC and DNR as they push the polymet permits through, contrary to what we are doing at WaterLegacy and some of our other allies. They're also in court with us. So the public is paying both sides of this court case, and the state has hired not the Attorney General's office staff, attorneys that have been sworn to uphold the public interest. Instead, they have hired private corporate mining industry lawyers, and those are who are representing us. Just outrageous. Please go to the next slide. So as I said, this is happening right now. Those were bills, and those are things that have happened in the last 5 to 8 years. This is right now, today. These bills on the left, you can read what they're about. These have all been rolled into Senate File 969, by the way, because as you've probably heard, legislators these days, instead of passing individual bills to which they can be held accountable for a yes or no vote, they like to put together 200-page long collection of bills called omnibuses. So Senate File 959 is the so-called environment bill, and it includes these measures on the Senate side. In addition, the Senate holds the power to confirm or not confirm commissioners, and not confirming them is a way of firing them. We've seen this at the federal level, but here at the state level, in the last year, the Senate has removed 2 commissioners, Kelly and LaPink, Commerce and Labor and Industry, over political fights with the governor. And actually what they were trying to accomplish in some instances is trying to block the implementation of the clean car rules, which would promote electric vehicles in Minnesota. What I can tell you is it has been proven to the level of standard that I believe, because I have been there to watch the influence of the Koch brothers in the Republican caucuses in the state of Minnesota. And when I take a look at why are they working so hard to block electric cars, I remember that the Koch brothers don't sell electricity. The Senate is also holding out on either confirmation or lack of confirmation of DNR and MPCA commissioners. This is the way to increase leverage. When you're negotiating with a commissioner and you have the ability to fire them in an afternoon, they tend to be a little more docile. And this Senate has proven they're willing to fire Governor Walz's commissioners, as they've done for 2 of them. If you could go on to the next one. Now let's get into just a few examples that are out in the real world, so that you can wrap your heads around what does this mean for natural resources and water and things we care about. Some of you may recall a very large fish kill that we had in 2016 in the Whitewater River. Well, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health, and Department of Natural Resources took their sweet time in getting out there. Local residents discovered thousands of dead fish belly up in the stream, called them in, but it took them several days to get out there, and who knew, but stream water flows downhill. And by the time they got to the point of the fish kill and they took water quality samples, they couldn't find the cause, unable to pinpoint the causes of the fish kill. Well, the fact is, on nearby fields in the preceding 48 hours before the fish kill, manure, pesticides, and fertilizers had been spread, and that was followed by a 4-inch rainstorm. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of put 2 and 2 together, but our agencies kind of dragged their feet, and the samples they took were inconclusive. And as Jeff Broberg, one of our colleagues in natural resource protection, said, what killed the fish was normal farming practices. We have fish kills like this 3 or 4 times a year around Minnesota. And again, these are summertime fish kills that are caused directly by pollutants getting into the water. Next slide, please. For 5 years recently, I was the executive director of the Isaac Walton League, and one of our chapters during 2017, 2018 had a citizen-led E. coli water quality sampling of the Cedar River. Cedar River is in the Austin area, flows down into Iowa. These citizen teams took over 500 samples over the course of 2 summers, and we were testing for E. coli, this common yet dangerous bacteria. We took a step beyond what the state does. The state also does a limited amount of E. coli testing, and they had listed the river as impaired for E. coli, which means polluted beyond health standards. Well, we found that 70% of our 500 samples were exceeded human health limits. And then we did DNA testing to find out whose poop was in the water. And what we found is it was both hog, human, and cattle. So the human was coming from inappropriate septic systems or lack of septic systems, and the hog and cattle were the agricultural sources nearby. Our local chapter put pressure on the county to speed up their efforts of getting after people who don't have functioning septic systems to work on the human health sources. But the agricultural sources are still being treated with voluntary outreach and education. Well, that's like educating people about speed limits. Most people follow them, and those that are going to speed, if you just keep educating them, that doesn't change anything. Ironically, the Cedar River is a Cedar River water trail that is promoted by DNR for water-based recreation. So we are promoting the Cedar River as a wonderful place to get into. There's actually businesses that rent tubes and kayaks and other things, and people do float and paddle and swim down the river. But that quote at the top was one of the co-directors of that monitoring program. After he's a local resident and a former nature center director, after he's learned what he's learned, none of them would swim in the Cedar River again. So here we are as a state promoting people to get into water that we know is unhealthy, that we're refusing to do what is necessary to clean it up. And an anomaly, kind of an ironic fact that came out of our data was the safest place to swim in the Cedar River was right below the sewage outfall for the city of Austin. And you say, now, why is that? That's because the city of Austin has a high functioning sewage treatment plant, and they clean up the water to very safe standards. And it's a large volume, and they dump it into the river and dilute the polluted river. I'm sorry. They dilute the pollution in the river down to safe water standards. So ironically, parents, tell your kids to swim right below the sewage outfall. Next slide, please. I'll speed this up. Park Rapids is a community in northwestern Minnesota. They've had to replace their public drinking water because it's been polluted by agricultural activities nearby. Millions of dollars to install a new public drinking water system because we can't enforce what RD off at potato growers are doing with their pesticide spraying and water use. Go to the next slide, please. Water Gremlin. Some of you probably live in the East Metro area. You see White Bear Lake there. Water Gremlin is a plant that manufactures lead sinkers, lead posts for batteries, and other things like that. For 17 years, they were exceeding their trichloroethylene and lead release limits. They were reporting it. The MPCA was doing nothing. Local people got upset. They had to sue to actually get the public data. And finally, the MPCA is cracking down on them after the public had to, in essence, force their way into the situation. I want to point out that the MPCA only has 9 inspectors for 3,500 industrial dischargers. This is a structural problem. As wonderful as those 9 people very well may be, they can't possibly look after 400 dischargers each. They're not visiting them. They don't even have time to read their reports. Next slide, please. So this is the last thing that I'm going to point out before I turn it over to Paula. And this is the timeline of the decline and fall of citizen influence in our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, just one of our regulatory agencies, but one that we focus on at WaterLegacy because of our work with the mining industry. Back in 1967, before the first Earth Day, which was 51 years ago today, 3 years before that, the state of Minnesota was very forward-looking and established the Pollution Control Agency with a citizen governing board. And so this was citizens that had the actual governing authority to oversee what the professional staff was doing. They actually did a lot of wonderful things in these years. In the early 1990s, under Governor Carlson, the commissioner, who was a person who had 20 years in the taconite industry before he came to be appointed to the MPCA commissioner, he decided that the citizen-led board was just too annoying for the professional staff, and if he were appointed the chair, he could probably bring them into line. So he was, with some change of legislation, and gradually the MPCA board became more and more docile because it was led by, it's like a strong chief executive. 911 was a setback for transparency in government. This was not directly as a result of corporate influence, but because of concerns about security, our state agencies and other agencies around the country began to lock down. Before that, you used to be able to walk into the MPCA, talk to the employees, and citizens had easy flow in and out. They've now instituted security. You have to know who you're talking to. You have to have an appointment. And it just gets harder and harder for the citizens to actually engage with regulators. In 2015, I mentioned briefly before, the MPCA board was finally swept away when they had the temerity to overrule the staff and require an EIS for that very large dairy. And most recently, this past year, they went ahead and implemented a routine document destruction practice so that their internal conversations and chats, these are all electronic these days, are electronically shredded, making it harder for Paula to find out what's actually going on. I'm going to let Paula tell us now what the result of this lack of transparency can lead to.
All right, thank you so much, Don, for giving an overview. I think I'm going to talk mostly about WaterLegacy's work and not only the problems, but what we are doing to begin to solve them. And first, the concept of broken promises. And I think there are 2 broken promises. The first one I want to talk about is the promise that the United States government made to tribal communities when we basically took their land. And you can see on this picture, there's a red polygon, which is tribal ceded territories under the Treaty of 1854. And you can see those sort of reddish brown little squares. Those are the remaining reservations. And when the United States government made a treaty, an agreement to the Indians that we would take all that land and use it, and they could have their reservations, we promised in writing that it would be reserved unto tribes to be able to use those resources for hunting, fishing, and gathering of plants, including wild rice. And what has happened with Minnesota state agencies' mismanagement of the taconite industry, and which is even more threatened by proposed sulfide mining, is a disproportionate impact on the wetlands, forests, and water resources of the tribes. And the quote from the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, which you see on your screen, is actually from comments on the polymet permits. And the quote is, "The exercise of these treaty rights requires access to natural resources that are not contaminated." So when our state agencies fail to control mining pollution and are proposing weak, unenforceable, and dangerous permits for sulfide mining, this is in a very real sense broken promises. And if you want to look at the other map, that Duluth complex, that orange blob, that is the location where sulfide mining is being proposed. And the little CUs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 is polymet and 2 is twin metals. And you can see on the far, I don't know if it's left of your screen, it's left of mine, there's a CU that says 5. That is the Talon project. And even though we haven't talked about it a lot in the news media, it is a really important threat because it has a very high level of copper and nickel compared to the other projects like polymet and twin metals that have a low-grade ore body. And so it is likely to be a financially profitable mine, which makes it a threat. And the Talon project threatens the Mississippi River watershed. The polymet project threatens primarily the Lake Superior watershed and the tribal ceded territories, but also the Boundary Waters Canoe area, which is also within the tribal ceded territories. Whereas Twin Metals, as many of you know, is right on the edge of the Boundary Waters. So we're looking at this as an environmental issue, but also under US Executive Order 12898, and there's a similar policy in Minnesota, that the agencies are supposed to prevent disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects on minority and low-income communities and also on tribal communities who rely on these resources for cultural survival as well as for physical sustenance. Next slide. Okay, now the other broken promise is the one that Lake Wobegon made to us, that Minnesotans, we like to believe all of our children are above average, however statistically improbable that is. And we like to believe that we do everything better than other places. And the sulfide mining lobbyists and their advocates repeatedly perpetuate this myth, saying that Minnesota is a great place to have sulfide mining because of our strong system of regulation. Well, one of the things I want to talk to you about as we go through these individual slides is how inaccurate, how flawed that myth is. And in fact, Minnesota does not have strong regulations. They're not properly enforced. And every time that WaterLegacy and our allies have begun to enforce something, the goalposts change and the industry and the agencies work to get rid of the standards that we just succeeded in enforcing. And at the bottom of the page, you can see there, that's a picture of the tailings dam failure of the Brumadinho, Brazil mine. And that tailings dam is built with upstream dam construction, which is the same kind of construction that has been permitted by the Minnesota DNR for the polymet project. That is upstream dam construction is the cheapest and the riskiest form of dam construction. Upstream dam failures include the Mount Polley, British Columbia, massive dam failure, the Samarco, Brazil dam failure, where pollution went 385 miles downstream until it hit the ocean. I was just saying, the Brumadinho, Brazil dam failure resulted in 270 lives lost, mostly workers. And the recent Piney Point, Florida mine, the phosphogypsum one that you might have heard about, that Piney Point huge, massive leak is also an upstream dam. And the reason so much pollution and contamination has been diverted out of that dam is to avoid the collapse. Now, many other places actually have stronger regulations. Other countries, such as Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Ecuador, all ban upstream dams like the one that DNR approved for polymet. Next slide. Now, one of the things that WaterLegacy has and our allies have spent a huge amount of time and resources doing is opposing the polymet permit to mine, and dam safety permits. And these are the permits that are issued by the Minnesota DNR. And here are some of the reasons, some of the problems with these permits. In large part, due to the pressure of the legislators and the governor, the DNR let Polymet dictate its own terms. So here are a few of the most egregious problems. We already talked about the upstream dam. That is the cheapest and the most dangerous. And the reason why it's the most dangerous is that the dam is built on top of uncompacted wet tailings, which have the consistency of sand or sometimes even talcum powder, rather than being built on a solid foundation. The Polymet project was also approved with unproven seepage collection and unlined permanent waste facilities. And throughout the process of environmental review, WaterLegacy repeatedly asked the DNR to tell Polymet, show us one case anywhere where unlined seepage collection, like what you're proposing here, a little pipe in a huge trench, actually collected what they were promising, which is over 97% of waste of all contaminating water being collected. DNR never required Polymet to prove their system would work. And every case where this system has been used, it has been used for Superfund projects. No one builds projects new like this. And the rate of collection has been much, much lower than what Polymet promised. Now, even though we have an environmental review system, the DNR did not consider any of the experts or alternatives proposed by WaterLegacy, by other environmental groups, or by the tribes. And there were a lot of scientific expert reports that the comments were basically, well, we read it, and we still are going to go ahead with the plan because that's what Polymet wants. And one of the most troubling things of all is throughout this process, it was clear, and some of the independent experts pointed it out to DNR, that the Polymet project depended on multi-billion-dollar corporation Glencore, one of the worst corporations worldwide in terms of corruption and labor abuses, that this project, the Polymet project, would only work if Glencore was providing the primary financing. And after the permits were issued, Polymet disclosed the degree to which Glencore was really in charge. Yet Glencore is on none of the permits, so that if something went wrong, Polymet, a shell corporation, could go bankrupt, and Glencore would walk away, leaving the problem for Minnesota's environment and Minnesota's taxpayers. So for these reasons, on January 13th, 2020, the Court of Appeals overturned the Polymet permits and required contested case hearings on dam safety, on tailing storage, and on whether Glencore should be on the permit. And this is our moment of celebration. You can see everybody smiling. But the Minnesota Supreme Court took the appeal that Polymet and the DNR joined in asking for. And we argued the case this fall, but we haven't yet heard what the Minnesota Supreme Court is going to do. Now, fortunately, while this litigation is going on, the Polymet permit to mine and dam safety permit are suspended. In fact, all of the Polymet permits now are suspended, as I'll explain a little more, so that no harm is being done, no holes are being dug or pollution starting. But still, we're in a position now where I don't know the answer that will be coming out of the Minnesota Supreme Court. Next slide. Now, we know a little bit about, I know there's been more coverage of the Polymet water pollution permit and the degree of collusion between the MPCA and the EPA. Now, in March 2018, it was the close of the public comment period. And usually at that time, you find out what have all the other parties in the case said about the permit. And in every other case I've ever been involved with, every other permit, much less important permits, there have been comments from the EPA in writing. And we got word from whistleblowers that there were not going to be any EPA comments. And so WaterLegacy began a process of, it ended up being 7 State Data Practices Act requests, 9 Freedom of Information Act requests, 2 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits to try and get a hold of the documents that would tell the true story. And by January 2019, and that you just heard that in the paper the other day, we and the Fond du Lac Band and our allies had appealed the Polymet water pollution permit. And we had talked with a retired EPA attorney who said, the information that you've gotten from Data Practices Act, something is wrong here because there should have been an EPA set of comments. And we went to Betty McCollum and we worked with this EPA retired guy, Jeff Fowley, and we made a big press stink about this, and Jeffrey Fowley filed the first EPA Inspector General complaint. And what you heard hopefully you read in the paper today, or maybe saw on Facebook yesterday or Twitter, is that the EPA Inspector General has now found that EPA Region 5 failed to follow its own rules and policies in the Polymet permit. And a big thing that they broke their own rules is, even though EPA kept saying, we're going to comment, we think this permit is weak, at the end of the day, when all of the program staff and attorneys came to the political appointees and said, we want to submit these written comments, the political appointees in the administration, the past administration at the EPA, said no. And WaterLegacy was able to get a copy of those comments as a result of Freedom of Information Act litigation in June of 2019. And shortly after we got those comments and they were released to the press, the Court of Appeals, in our appeal, granted us the ability to send the case back to district court to find out if MPCA had done anything irregular. And at that point, the Court of Appeals suspended the water pollution permit. So that was the first break in the case. And we've been litigating for quite some time. The WaterLegacy lawsuit that went to court in district court, the court did find that the MPCA engaged in irregular procedures. Not only did the court find that, as a matter of fact, the MPCA asked EPA to withhold their comments, that it was MPCA's initiative to do that, but also the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they destroyed smoking gun emails that are usually kept that showed their process of begging the EPA to withhold their comments. And right now, we still have a case going forward asking the Court of Appeals to throw out the water pollution permit, and that's on hold until the Minnesota Supreme Court decides what's going to happen with the permit to mine. Next slide. Now, Don mentioned the importance of Mercury and Fish and the health department. In 2011, the health department did a study and they tested 1,400 infants in Minnesota's Lake Superior region, and 1 out of 10 infants were born with unsafe levels of mercury. And every time I talk to doctors in Duluth, they say, well, what's happened to that study? And the answer is nothing. And many Minnesota rivers and lakes and streams are impaired due to excessive mercury. In February 2013, MPCA derailed a study that would have identified the causes of that increased high level of mercury contamination as one goes further and further downstream down the St. Louis River. Now, most of the scientists we know believe that that increase in mercury contamination of fish, with the risk that it poses to infants and children, is due to the contribution of sulfates and other mining pollution as you go further down the St. Louis River. Because the science has clearly shown that excessive sulfate releases mercury from the sediments and also methylates the mercury and turns it into the kind of mercury that can bioaccumulate in the insects and in the fish and affect us because we're at the top of the food chain. Now, the EPA comments in 2018, the suppressed comments, they made a specific point that mercury and the combination of sulfate and mercury released by pollute posed a danger to the downstream communities, which include the Fond du Lac reservation waters, as well as the communities of Duluth and Lake Superior itself. And based on some research that we did in 2015, which I published in a law review journal, the Fond du Lac band argued that they had a right under the Clean Water Act as a downstream quote unquote state to object to the federal permit that would allow pollute to discharge and to destroy wetlands. And this February, a federal district court allowed Fond du Lac's claim to go forward, that the band might be affected by pollution, and particularly mercury pollution from pollute. And so based on that victory in court, the EPA said they wanted to reconsider and make a decision whether the pollute project may affect the Fond du Lac band. And now the federal pollute permit, as well as the state pollute permits, have been stayed, this time by the Army Corps of Engineers. And you look at the picture, these are children of all different ages and kinds, and realize that Don was talking about the importance of the health department and their independence. Groups representing, early on in the pollute process in 2014, groups representing more than 30,000 doctors and nurses called for a health impact assessment before the pollute permits were issued. And these requests were denied on the grounds that they didn't want a medical study to possibly undermine what they had done in rubber stamping the environmental review, or to delay the project. That was the basis. And so we see that in addition to affecting water, the risks of sulfide mining really have to do with human health, and particularly the health of infants and children, and in communities where people rely on fish for subsistence, not just for recreation. Next slide. Now, I think we need to understand, if we want to talk about, is Minnesota a quote unquote good place to do sulfide mining? It may actually be like the TV series. It may be the exact opposite of a good place, because the MPCA has a history of not making the taconite mines comply with the law. And their failures include expired and out of date permits, lack of enforcement of permits, permits that don't set water quality based limits on pollution, and permits that don't consider the effects of tribal treaty resources or include real consultation with tribes. And so we've worked in partnership with tribes, and our initial effort was a petition to EPA to just take away MPCA's authority. And we were making some progress on getting that done in investigations until the election in 2016. And then we successfully overturned a variance for Maccabee Nugget. And recently we've been in court with the Fond du Lac band as allies. And this February, we won a big case at the Minnesota Supreme Court having to do with the US Steel Mintac tailings basin, which is this ugly gray picture on the side. And we got a ruling that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency can control sulfate pollution harming groundwater, and that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency couldn't keep ducking its requirement to control sulfate that was harming wild rice. And a really important thing to realize when we're thinking about what, well, we're not, but lots of people are thinking about allowing copper nickel sulfide mining, which is far more toxic than taconite mining, is that of all the mine permits we've looked at with citizen experts' help, There's no Minnesota taconite mine that is in full compliance with existing water quality standards. Next slide. Okay, this is a lot of information, so I'm not gonna say all of it. Minnesota has had a wild rice sulfate standard since 1973. For a long time, it wasn't enforced. Then in 2010, the US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, told the state of Minnesota, you've got to enforce this rule. It's a water quality standard under the Clean Water Act. It's your job to enforce it. So from 2010 to 2018, there was basically a massive effort by industry and by the PCA as well to weaken or repeal or get rid of the standard. And we ended up having to fight that in court, and WaterLegacy won. And then we went through a long process of study. And initially, the Pollution Control Agency scientists said, this standard is needed and reasonable. And then there was a meeting with the governor and the commissioner, and the range legislators were very displeased. And after that, since then, the PCA tried to basically get rid of its own standard. And it was required an administrative law judge hearing, and the administrative law judge and chief administrative law judge in 2018 concluded that the MPCA couldn't get rid of its wild rice sulfate standard or weaken it because it would violate federal law. And then the legislature didn't care, and they passed 2 bills to try and get rid of the standard, which thankfully, with a whole lot of citizen organizing, Governor Dayton vetoed. Another struggle, and this struggle we've just recently made progress. We've been trying for a decade to get the state of Minnesota to list wild rice waters that have so much sulfate in them that it is harming the wild rice. And we worked in alliance with the tribes, and finally, under this new administration in 2021, the EPA has disapproved Minnesota's failure to list even a single wild rice water impaired due to sulfate. And sometime this week, we'll get the EPA's preliminary list for public comment of wild rice impaired waters. Next slide. And this is our current fight. And so far, we are at the state level. The MPCA, no sooner have we begun to get victories in court and the EPA saying that the standards that we had on the books for sulfate and other salts had to be enforced, then the MPCA started to work with industry to remove or weaken those standards. And recently the MPCA proposed basically to get rid of class 3 and 4 numeric water quality standards that limit salts and ions. This is the suite of pollution that is particularly representative of taconite and sulfide mining pollution, as well as other dischargers like ethanol. And the potential rules would kill sensitive fish. They would increase the sulfate's ability to increase mercury contamination. They would cause harm to fishing and tourism and sustainable farming. And no water quality would ever improve as a result of these new standards. It would just benefit polluters. And MPCA basically admitted that the rules would reduce workload and they would make it easier for dischargers. And you can see the pictures of the spotted salamander and the lake sturgeon and a sustainable farm. These are just some of the uses of water that would be harmed. And at this point, the administrative law judge rubber stamped, next slide, rubber stamped MPCA's proposal, despite the fact that there were over 1,000 comments opposed, and every scientist or member of the public was opposed to these rules. So our next step is we're going to have to be going to the EPA and asking for them, as they can under the Clean Water Act, to disapprove these rules. And we're not sure exactly what the timing is, but please, if you'd like to be part of the team, coming to the EPA, communicating with them, our concern, we're going to try and set up a virtual hearing with the EPA. Put your name in the chat or email me at paula@waterlegacy.org. as a person who wants to talk with the EPA about what's going wrong with MPCA rulemaking. We're also trying to go positive. And so 33 organizations and 460 individuals joined in a petition that would ask MPCA, and they have to formally respond to this because it's a petition, not just a letter, to adopt new rules that actually protect water and health and fish and wildlife and wild rice. And our next step here is we're going to wait and see what the MPCA has, if they're going to do any changes, because right now MPCA's plans are to deregulate pollution, but not to adopt the kinds of standards that are needed to protect fish and wildlife and to protect the human beings that rely on safe and healthy fish to eat. Next slide. So here we are. How do we restore regulatory accountability? You can see that we've had a lot of successes at WaterLegacy in partnership with our tribes and our allies, but we're playing whack-a-mole because each time we get someplace, we have to fight again and again and again because our agencies are not anticipating what can we do to protect people and to protect water rather than polluters. And so our thought at WaterLegacy, yes, we have been very successful, whether it's getting polymet permits stalled or preserving the sulfate standard or starting to regulate taconite mines, but we can't keep up with the number of bad ideas that the mining industry and our captured agencies are coming up with. So our goal now is to work with you and build a movement that starts from the bottom up and demands a change in our politics so that our agencies remember the promise of Earth Day, which is to protect people and to protect water and to protect land, not to protect polluters. Last slide. Next slide. So what can we do? What I'm asking, what are Don and I and Waverly asking you to do? First, learn about regulatory capture. You've already done a lot by being here today. Second, educate your friends and neighbors so that they see that this is a really important existential issue about environmental protection and environmental health. I think it's important to advocate for EPA oversight and MPCA reform. And we are beginning to work together on ways that we can actually have people in Minnesota, through the magic of Zoom, talk to some of the people at the Environmental Protection Agency who will be making decisions. We believe that it was very helpful in listing wild rice impaired waters to have some of our active volunteers explain what this means to them. And we'd like to invite you to send me your information or put it in the chat, and Waverly and I will keep track of it when we're able to set up meetings with the EPA. And then really important, contact your elected official, vote for and support public interest candidates. Some of the people in your district may already be that kind of person. Just send them a brief thank you note, say Happy Earth Day. Happy Earth Day. We know that you're doing your best to protect people and the environment. And if you've got a district where your representative doesn't deserve a thank you card, get active. And then please donate and get involved with us. And most of all, important, believe in your own power. Because we will only really make changes, not by playing whack-a-mole, but when we have a community standing together to protect clean water. And then I bet we have questions. We're here for as long as you need to be. Waverly, do we have questions?
Yes. Let's see. Linda Heron asked when the MPCA held the public comment period recently, several municipal waste program managers commented that if these deregulations don't pass, then they'll have huge expenses ongoing to clean up their waste. So what can we say to those managers or, those cities?
We can say two things. The first thing we can say is that The law already provides that public or small businesses who can't afford to clean up can get variances. And in fact, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has a system to allow those wastewater treatment facilities to get variances. What the problem is with changing the rules is that those variances are forever, and they go to companies like the big taconite mines, which can afford the change. Now, the other thing is, if you have a variance, it expires in a few years, and you create incentives for public funding, because much of the progress that has been made in wastewater treatment is a partnership between a small local area and either federal or state money or both. So by changing the rules, not only do you make it dangerous for all the water, but you remove the incentive for us to share the responsibility. Don, you want to jump in with anything, or did I cover it?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say better than a variance, I think, is to upgrade the water treatment plant with public dollars. When the Clean Water Act was passed, we had a 90% grant to local communities, mostly federal money, some state money, to cover the cost with a 10% local match. Right now, we're down to a 50% loan. So instead of giving a small local impoverished community 90% of the money they need for the upgrade, we've just shrunk that commitment back. And people are very supportive of clean water. The public is absolutely willing to pay for it. And rather than a variance, I would rather help with money that this country does have to pay to protect our water and just up those grants. Right now in the state legislature, they are proposing some money for a state grant program that does go to communities with hardship. So you can write to your legislator right now and say, I want those wastewater treatment grants available for small communities and maintain our water quality standards.
And this is, I think this is a false front. The mining companies and the big coal plants and the ethanol plants, they put the small cities up in front of them. One other thing, many of the small cities that have real discharge problems, it's because they're getting untreated wastewater from large corporate entities who are just passing on their pollution problems. There are many solutions, and the only unacceptable solution is to get rid of the water quality standards. Are there other?
We have some, yes. Kathy asked, has Lieutenant Governor Flanagan been helpful?
I would have to say at this point, I haven't seen any evidence that anyone in the state of Minnesota has been helpful on the issues of stopping the Pollute project, or requiring Glencore to be responsible, or enacting water quality standards and protecting water quality standards so we don't see deregulation of pollution. It's hard to know what's happening behind the scenes and whether the lieutenant governor is advocating and simply not being able to overwhelm the status quo.
Great. Drew Campbell asked, just if anyone has a link or information on one of the copper nickel mine tailings proposed sites. He said it's not in the St. Louis River watershed, but could flow northward and westward to the Rainy River watersheds and are part of the Voyageurs National Park, Rainy Lakes, etc. Any good link, or has that site now been moved off of the table? Do you know about that?
I'm not quite sure which site he's referring to.
It
So,
sounds like Twin Metals.
because Twin Metals is right in the Boundary Waters watershed, and that is definitely it's still being proposed, even though there are a lot of efforts to stop it with either federal legislation or with litigation. If what you're thinking of is not the Twin Metals project, please just send us an email and we can identify what it is that you're concerned about, if it's something that's only in an exploration stage.
Okay, yeah, I can.
Oh, go ahead.
And then I used to work as a county commissioner for about 9 years here in Blue Earth County, and I was on the Minnesota River Board that was formed back in the early 90s. And I can tell you that how difficult it is working on the Minnesota River watershed, and to get the, I guess, the political buy-in for protections. If you can get county commissioners and get even city councilors and people elected that really understand it's better to protect than it is to clean up. And that that's just a simple thought process. But if you look at the money it costs, instead of taking the risks, thinking, oh, we can clean that up later if something happens. And getting people elected that really can understand it. And they can be on both sides of the aisle. It's the idea of getting somebody who values those values. They can be a Republican, they can be a Democrat. Because I've worked with both who value our environment and understand the investment we need to make to keep things at least at status quo.
Absolutely true. I noticed one other comment in the comments having to do with, so the Minnesota House of Representatives is not being helpful. And what I would say is that is absolutely true. We have not mentioned here, but we should, the Prove It First legislation that's been introduced in both the House and the Senate with 35 co-sponsors in the House. This is a conservative piece of legislation that mirrors what Wisconsin state law was for 20 years towards copper nickel mining. It said, prove it first somewhere else. Let's see the industry point to a mine that is opened, operated, and closed in a similar environment without violating the laws or polluting. Because we hear so much from the industry about, oh, we have new technology, all those disasters are in the past, we're going to do better next time. And so it's just a conservative approach to our resources, prove it first elsewhere. We cannot get a hearing in either the Democratic controlled Senate, Democratic controlled House, or the Republican controlled Senate. The lock that the industry, when we talk about regulatory capture, that extends to our political establishments. The mining industry has captured the governors of all parties, the legislature, and the House of both parties. And it is a don't ask, don't tell. We can't even have a hearing to talk about the wiseness of this particular policy, which was state law in Wisconsin until Governor Walker and the mining industry teamed up to repeal it a few years ago. So this is an example where legislators need to hear, you need to start acting in the long-term best interest of the people of the state, which includes taking a conservative approach to protecting clean water, which is more valuable than any copper or nickel we have anywhere. We have 10% of the world's supply of fresh water in Lake Superior alone, and that's at risk from the polymet mine. So
I think it's really important that people realize that right now, the problem doesn't start at the agencies. The problem starts at the legislature, and it starts in the elected officials. And until we create a voice, and that's why I'm thinking about this rally today, this is just a small step for us to actually show up, put on your mask and make it COVID safe, but show up on the governor's doorstep and say, yes, we need to think about environmental protection. We need to think about protecting our air and water and land for generations to come. Until people take this as a hard issue, a values issue, we're getting stymied by the legislature, and we're getting stymied by our governor. And so far, most of our victories are because the courts have required them.
Elaine had a question. If it's possible, maybe how do we get support from the new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland?
Well, this is an issue that's very interesting because there has been an important change that I think is also helping our work as Water Legacy and has a great deal of opportunity for the future. Is Minnesota tribes more and more have banded together to advocate in their joint interests. And so the advocacy with Deb Holland, there will be advocacy all across the country, and it will be unified tribal advocacy. As far as the work that Water Legacy is doing, Polymed is not a project that affects the Department of Interior, but I think that it is a very important appointment. It is a historic appointment for one of the people who comes from an Indigenous community to have that level of responsibility. And it's going to make a great deal of difference. We're already seeing as Water Legacy that the change in administration has made a great deal of difference in terms of our ability to talk with the EPA and their willingness to listen. And I think that will be doubly true at the Department of Interior.
The Department of Interior can be helpful though with the Twin Metals mine,
Yes.
which is the one that is directly in the Boundary Waters watershed.
If people want to raise their hands, if there's, or are you, would that help you, Waverly, since there's so many comments in the chat?
Some of it's just discussion, which is great. So for everyone to go in and read that. Let's see. Sharon asked, how can we find out if our legislators support Prove It First? I'll say Friends of the Boundary Waters, that organization, they have a really great website on Prove It First, and which includes a list of the legislators that are in support of Prove It First. So head on over to their website and you'll be able to see if yours is on there.
And I also put in the link there, a link to the bill. So you can look at the 35 co-sponsors in the House. Their names are under that link. And then if you click on the Senate companion, which is also there, you can find the 5 senators.
Wendy Ward had a question. Could you talk more about the growing potato industry in Minnesota and how cities will permit through zoning allowances large potato farming parcels, yet then those cities must invest in infrastructure to clean that potato runoff and groundwater. She said it's not smart governance.
I can talk about a piece of it, and because I was involved in initially when Offutt was coming into Minnesota to do massive destruction of forests and conversion to a corporate one crop agriculture. Initially the Department of Natural Resources said that they were willing to do environmental impact assessment, and they backed down. And this was one example where I feel that there was a lot of community understanding and a department that actually knew the risk to water quality and water quantity, and yet was unwilling to take a stand. And I'm, one of the things that we work a lot in the area of mining, where there is a lot of legal constraints on what people can do. And what I learned to my horror in trying to work on the potato growing practices is that in many areas of agriculture, some of the Clean Water Act tools are simply not there. And so what we need is we need to have an agency who will act, not because they have no choice because we're going to beat them in court, but they act because they know what's right to protect the water. And that didn't happen.
There's a wonderful group called Toxic Taters that people can look up online. That's the local people who are working hard to fight that expansion of the destruction of the forest and the expansion of the potato growing in the Park Rapids area.
What else? Alan asked, should it be regarded as a matter of law enforcement rather than political deal making? And I'm going to say there's a third paradigm that I'd like people to think about. Right now, WaterLegacy is doing law enforcement. We're suing people for doing things that are illegal. And I think the paradigm that we want people to be thinking about is starting out with words very similar to what the Attorney General said on the day of Derek Chauvin's conviction, is that nobody's above the law and nobody's below the law. And the idea that Polymet or US Steel or Twin Metals are not above the law. And the citizens in the community who are just speaking from their own hearts, or the tribal members who are coming and asking to protect their resources, are not below the law. And that is a sort of a happy zone where the rule of law and the public interest are what's the center. And we don't have to be in the mode we are now, which is we end up spending a lot of time telling people, you must do this or we will sue you. And I wanted to say before we wind up that some things have really changed in a positive way in the community over the past 11 years. I think if we had talked 11 years ago, when WaterLegacy was formed, many of the big environmental organizations were only concerned about protecting the boundary waters. Now we have many allies, the Minnesota Environmental Partnership, Friends of the Boundary Waters, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, who are working on stopping sulfide mining, period, and not treating any area of Minnesota as a sacrifice zone. That is a huge change. It makes us much more powerful. Another change that I think is really, really helpful, if we had talked to people 11 years ago, before the exposure of all the polymet collusion between the Pollution Control Agency and the EPA, every single time I talked to someone, they believed that Minnesota was a great place to do copper nickel mining because we did such a great job. And I think that there are a lot of people who realize that Minnesota has to take a lot of action and get our house in order, and certainly should not be taking the risk of sulfide mining at this point. I'd say another thing that has really changed is the number of both native and non-native people who see the issue of environmental justice as predominant and important and worthwhile. So we're not just trying to protect the water for its beauty, we're trying to protect it as part of our spiritual heritage as an entire community and for tribal people for generations to come. And so, yes, there are, we've talked about a number of things that are wrong. Also, I have to say, when we started this work, no one believed that Polymet would not have gotten a shovel in the ground. And it's 2021 and their permits are still suspended. So with a combination of support for hard-edged litigation and alliance with tribes and partners, and a huge amount of citizen awareness and backing and comments, we've at least kept some of the worst things at bay. So I want to say that, yes, there's a regulatory capture, but there's also us, and we are important, and we as a community make a difference.
The only solution to regulatory capture is citizen involvement. That's the only way we will take our government back. And right now, those of us who are within range, we can all meet at 4 o'clock outside the governor's mansion to start that process.